Hunters Point is a former Navy shipyard located on 638 acres of waterfront in the southeast corner of San Francisco. It was purchased by the Navy in 1940, a year before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and it was used commercially for some time. But after World War II, the shipyard was repurposed into the U.S. military's largest facility for applied nuclear research. For decades, the shipyard was used to decontaminate ships from Operation Crossroads, which is a pair of nuclear weapons tests conducted by the U.S. in 1946. Because of all the testing, Hunters Point became widely contaminated with radioactivity. Today, it has been nicknamed San Francisco's radioactive basement. Despite this, Hunters Point has been turned into a site of residential development for families looking for more affordable neighborhoods to live in. There are promises of homes, playgrounds, and businesses for a space-constrained city with a major housing shortage. But isn't it dangerous to live in an area with radioactive contamination? Yes, and that's exactly why it was such a big deal when it was discovered that Tetra Tech, the government contractor hired to clean radioactive contamination from the site, botched the cleanup.
The biggest case of eco-fraud in U.S. history. That's what an environmental advocacy group is calling the massive cleanup at the old Hunters Point Naval Base in San Francisco. Newly released documents show that almost all of the radiation data is unreliable.
Almost all of the cleanup work was later shown to be falsified or suspect. Tetra Tech employees had been swapping contaminated samples with clean ones, making it seem as though the area was free of radioactivity and safe to live in. We're going to get into the serious health implications caused by this a little later on, but first we want to answer the question of, why exactly did this site need to be cleaned? How did Hunters Point become contaminated in the first place?
Well, to understand this, we need to go back to the 1940s. From 1940 to 1943, the number of African American families in San Francisco grew from 2,000 to 12,000. These families were coming to get the jobs that the shipyard was offering. But after World War II, these jobs went from building ships to decontaminating radioactive ships. So this is where the radioactivity at the shipyard comes from. Although the Navy was supposed to decontaminate these radioactive ships, they instead started testing on them and formed the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory. They tested the radioactivity on the soil. They used the radioactivity from the ships to test on tens of thousands of animals, and they even kept tabs on the workers to see if they would develop any negative health effects, which these workers did. That's why the radioactivity at Hunters Point is important to the families who still live there, because the families that went there to work there live there to this day and are affected by the health problems that they developed while working with this radioactive material. About 79 ships passed through the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard. One of these ships was the USS Independence, which came towards the beginning of this experimentation and decontamination in 1946. Where did these ships come from? Bikini Bottom! Well, they didn't exactly come from Bikini Bottom, but they did come from a place that Bikini Bottom is named after. Let's go back in time to 1946 and follow the radioactive ships back to Bikini Atoll in Marshall Islands. Bikini Atoll used to have 167 people living there. Unfortunately, in 1946, the Navy came and asked the Bikinians to leave, saying that they were going to do some nuclear tests on the atoll, but the Bikinians could show up later and reclaim their home after the tests were over. Here's a video showing what the Navy told the world about their experiments.
This is Bikini. It is here that the military and scientific personnel of Joint Task Force 1 will conduct the tests with the atomic bomb. Only by unleashing the destructive force of atomic energy against an array of ships could the Navy determine the future ship design of modern naval sea power. The target orientation for Test Able was based on the directive of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It required that the 90 ships anchored in Bikini Lagoon be so disposed as to secure graded ship damage ranging from maximum to minimum. The battleship USS Nevada, bomb aiming point, has been anchored at the exact center of the target array. Here to witness the completion of preparations is the President's Evaluation Commission. They will report the tests to the Commander-in-Chief. Lashed to the decks of ships are samples of military supplies and equipment. Airplanes, jeeps, trucks, and tanks, themselves targets on target ships. Animals were placed aboard some of the ships to substitute for military personnel. A study of their future life history will provide invaluable information. Steel towers 75 feet high have been erected on Bikini Atoll. Within these structures will be housed the remotely controlled cameras and specially designed scientific instruments that will record the data resulting from the blast.
At Operation Crossroads, the Navy exploded 2 bombs. The first they named Able, which was dropped above Bikini Atoll. The second was named Baker, which was exploded beneath the water's surface. The point of these bombs was to test to see how the ships would fare under a nuclear attack. These bombs were the same make as the Fat Man, which was dropped on Nagasaki during World War II. But just how powerful is the Fat Man? Let's look at the Fat Man's blast field. When it explodes, the Fat Man releases about 20 kilotons of TNT. This is around 23 million kilowatts of energy. One house in California needs around 6,741 kilowatts per year. 100 Californian houses need about 674,000 kilowatts per year. This means that 100 California houses could be powered for 34.5 years with the amount of energy that the Fat Man releases. 34.5 years. That's a lot. You can see why people want to use nuclear energy to power their houses and different things. However, each nuclear power plant always has the danger of a meltdown. If the Nagasaki or Fat Man bomb was dropped on Stanford, it would cause around 20,000 deaths and around 40,000 injuries. The outer ring shows where the windows would break. Then there would be third-degree burns, fatal radiation, the residential buildings would collapse, the more fortified buildings would collapse, and at the center, there's a fireball. It's safe to say that the Fat Man devastated Bikini Atoll and the ships that it was meant to explode. Here's the USS Independence after the explosions. The soldiers, pretty quickly after these explosions, were told to go and gather samples and check out the radiation. As you can see, they're not very well equipped to handle things like radioactive sand. In fact, when these explosions were happening, the soldiers were only 10 miles away and they were told to just cover their eyes, but they weren't given any other protective equipment. Because of the lack of protective equipment that these soldiers wore, and because this is a thing that happened throughout America's different nuclear tests, 1 in 5 atomic veterans have health problems related to the nuclear tests. Unfortunately, the damage doesn't stop there. The Bikinians were not able to return home permanently. Here's Bikini Atoll now. The Navy planted some palm trees there in hopes of restoring the atoll to its former glory. But psych, the radioactivity got into the food chain. The coconuts are now radioactive. At first, the Bikinians were told to move to Rongerik. They were told they'd be safe there, but the fallout from the explosions did follow them there, and they still have a lot of health problems from that. In the 1970s, they were told they could go back to the Bikini Atoll and that everything was good. Then they found out about the radioactive coconuts and were forced to move to Kili Island. Kili Island has its own set of problems, though. With the oceans rising, the island is consistently suffering from flooding. Therefore, Operation Crossroads not only took away these people's homes, it left them with no suitable places to live.
After looking at Bikini Atoll, naturally you'd wonder, how did this bomb come to be? For the purposes of this video, we're going to look specifically at the plutonium core within the nuclear bombs, because that is where the vast majority of the radiation at Hunter's Point originates from. The plutonium was created at Hanford site in southeastern Washington. At Hanford, there were two major steps. First of all, plutonium had to be created from uranium in a reactor, and then this plutonium had to be purified in a chemical separation process. So now we're going to look specifically at the reactor. So for the architecture of the reactor is a huge graphite cube. It is 36 feet wide, 36 feet tall, and 28 feet deep. Within this cube, there are 2004 pipes in which uranium fuel rods can be inserted. On the rods, there is a coating of aluminum that helps protect the uranium, and this coating will become important later. To the left of the reactor, there are 9 rods called control rods that can be inserted into the reactor. These will also be important later. So how exactly is plutonium created within a reactor? It is created by introducing neutrons to uranium that causes a chain reaction that ends up with plutonium after a long period of time. This science behind the reactor is the same exact science that belies nuclear weapons, and the only difference between a nuclear weapon and a reactor is that a reactor's reaction is controlled. So because we don't want the reactor to melt down and have a disaster, controlling the reactor is extremely important. But how do we do so? So the operators controlled the reactor in 2 ways. First of all, water was always circulating through the reactor, such that it lowered the temperature of the reactor, thereby slowing down the reaction. Similarly, operators could move the control rod such that it can absorb more neutrons within the reactor, slowing down the reaction process because the neutrons are what kicked off the process in the first place. So, for the operators, because they're operating the reactor 24/7, they also monitor it 24/7. So here you see a picture of a control panel that an operator at Hanford would keep track of. And on the control panel, there are, for water, the water temperature as well as the water pressure. And for the control rods, there are also gauges for where the control rods were within the reactor. With this information, the operators could figure out what the reaction process is and make steps, for instance, by moving the control rod to help control the reaction within the reactor. So now that we're done with the reactor and have plutonium, we can't just put this plutonium into a bomb because it's nowhere near pure enough for a weapon. This is where chemical separation comes in. At Hanford during this time, bismuth phosphate chemical separation was the way that plutonium was purified. This process is an extremely long, convoluted process that is nowhere near efficient. And as a simplified overview of what happens during this process, first of all, the aluminum coating on the fuel rods containing the plutonium had to be removed. And then after that, the reaction byproducts that were not plutonium were removed such that there was only plutonium left. Now, why is this process important? It's important because this process was so long and involved so many chemicals that ultimately created a bunch of radioactive materials because all of the chemicals were radioactive after the process. With all this radioactive material, it had to be stored somewhere, and it would be stored on tanks at Hanford site. And these tanks started leaking in the 50s, which caused environmental issues very similar to the one that Hunter's Point faces today.
Before Hanford was fully up and running, however, there was another facility that helped to purify uranium and ultimately produce plutonium for the Manhattan Project and other U.S. nuclear projects. Nestled in the valleys of East Tennessee, Oak Ridge National Laboratory was one of the first stops in the long road to nuclear weapons. Oak Ridge was an enormous technical achievement, but also a major drain on material resources and energy inputs. According to the facility's official website, in less than a year after it was founded in 1943, 150 buildings had been built using 30,000 cubic yards of concrete, 4 million board feet of lumber, 4,500 gallons of paint, and 1,716 kegs of nails. What more, the internal bus system of the facility was America's 6th largest at the time, and the lab used 20% more electricity than New York City, largely because of the uranium enrichment plants.
When the world was at war, America called. Not just soldiers and sailors, airmen and Marines, but scientists and engineers, builders and laborers, Nobel winners and teenagers just off the farm. They came to a valley and built a reactor that harnessed the atom and helped to end a terrible war.
The Y-12 plant was a uranium enrichment plant that used electromagnetic separation to split apart different uranium isotopes from uranium ore, allowing the creation of fissile material for the Manhattan Project. Ernest Lawrence of UC Berkeley did preliminary experiments there that supplied the data for the Oak Ridge facility. The Y-12 plant was built by several contractors and wound up being as big as 3 two-story buildings. It used an estimated 38 million feet of lumber and 15,000 tons of silver bullion for magnetic wiring, with 15,000 people involved in the construction work. Also essential to the facility was the experimental X-10 reactor, which used a fission chain reaction to add neutrons to uranium, turning it into plutonium, which could then be extracted from fuel slugs and purified. This Oak Ridge facility would eventually lay the groundwork for the Hanford site, essentially serving as a scale model. Of course, all that uranium didn't come out of thin air. It had to be extracted, and that extraction was a feat in and of itself, although not one without its share of losers. Enter the Shinkolobwe mine in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or what was at the time the Belgian Congo. Shinkolobwe had the world's highest known abundance of uranium, as well as a particularly high quality of it. Some of the ore was 65% uranium oxide, while that of most other sources on Earth is generally less than 1%. During World War II, it was feared that Nazi Germany would invade the Congo and get control over the radioactive material for use in its own nuclear program. To prevent that from happening, all of the mined uranium was shipped to a warehouse in Staten Island, New York, and that's where the uranium, 1,250 tons of ore stored in 2,000 steel drums, was kept until the Manhattan Project acquired it. Ultimately, uranium from Shinkolobwe would make up 80% of that used by the Manhattan Project. The Staten Island warehouse, meanwhile, would still be radioactive at least through the 80s. The Shinkolobwe mine was unique in its role in fueling the American nuclear program. Noted in a 1951 edition of Scientific American, there existed so rich a concentration of uranium at Shinkolobwe, unmatched, as far as we know, anywhere else on the surface of the Earth. But it wasn't all positive. In an interview with us, Professor Rodney Ewing, Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and Co-Director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation, discussed how the tailings left behind at Shinkolobwe and other mines in the Congo continue to have detrimental health impacts on the locals, long after the U.S. had already gotten the material it needed for the nuclear project.
With open pit mining or underground mining where you bring the material to the surface, what's done is the next step, which is to mill physically and chemically the uranium ore. It will be very low concentrations of uranium, so this is an enrichment step. You remove the uranium, but then you leave all of the decay products at the site.
Okay.
So what was taken, the uranium ore taken from underground, uranium ore taken from an open pit operation would be processed, and you would have a pile, the tailings they're called, of everything that's left, and what's left is a lot of radioactivity associated with the decayed products.
Whether it was at the site of the mines or at the site of the testing, there were serious human impacts felt along every single step of this process. Hunters Point is no exception. The harm done there was largely due to the fact that the radioactive waste was not properly disposed of. That led us to ask the question, what exactly should have happened to the contaminated waste at Hunters Point? Well, the proper way to dispose of low-level waste is to compact or incinerate it in a container that is built for long-term management, and then ship it to a radioactive waste site or a special landfill equipped to deal with radioactive waste. From there, it'll be buried. Intermediate-level waste should be solidified first and then buried deep underground. Neither of these happened to the waste at Hunters Point. Instead, the radioactive dirt was sent to conventional landfills that are not equipped to deal with radiological waste. From there, it could have ended up in a number of places. The soil could have been used for roads, parks, or building sites. It could have been used as cover at landfills and ended up blown into nearby neighborhoods. It could have contaminated water tables and been used for irrigation for crops. But it's not just soil. There was also contaminated furniture, fencing, concrete, and other material that could have been recycled and ended up doing harm to an unsuspecting public. This brings up the question of who is being impacted. Why is Hunters Point being called a textbook case of environmental injustice? The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This is extremely relevant to the case of Hunters Point, because there's a history of racial segregation and evictions from other parts of San Francisco, especially after World War II, that led Hunters Point to contain SF's largest black population and the highest percentage of people living below the federal poverty line. Hunters Point is being called one of the worst cases of environmental injustice in California history. This has a lot to do with the fact that conventional landfills tend to be located in communities lacking economic or political clout. No one wants nuclear waste near their communities, but not everyone has the resources to prevent it. As a result, the effects of the improper disposal of Hunters Point waste are likely disproportionately felt by minority, low-income communities. The most pressing of those effects have to do with health. The Environmental Protection Agency reports that more than 200 toxic chemicals heavily impacted the health of local residents. Their soil and water was contaminated with particulates, pesticides, asbestos, you name it. This led to serious and life-threatening health issues within the area. Rates of cervical and breast cancer were found to be 2 times the rate found in other parts of the Bay. Hospitalization rates for congestive heart failure, hypertension, diabetes, and emphysema were found to be more than 3 times the statewide average. What makes all of this even worse is that the most vulnerable residents are children and infants. A report from 2004 found that Hunters Point accounted for more than half of infant mortality in the SF area. The children of the area were also reported to be experiencing extreme challenges related to asthma. Now you may be wondering, is anyone being held accountable? Well, the Navy plans to complete a second round of testing for contamination, and they say that development will not resume until the area is clean. But there are a lot of concerns among residents about whether or not this will truly be the case. Can they trust that the area will be properly and completely cleaned when all efforts toward this end have failed in the past? Plus, so much damage has already been done. As for Tetra Tech, 2 employees have pleaded guilty and been sentenced to prison. A $27 billion lawsuit was filed against the company for blatant, conscious, and callous disregard of Bayview Hunters Point residents' lives, born and unborn, for the next 5 generations. The verdict is still out on that. If you're interested in finding out what happens or want to stay updated on the development of Hunters Point, it's regularly featured in the San Francisco Chronicle.
Now that we've followed the life of the A-bomb from cradle to where it is now, we can see that at every step, at every stage, people were impacted. Whether it was in the mining process, in the refining process, in the part where they're doing testing, where they have to remove people, or where they're deciding to put this radioactive material. People were impacted along the way. Some people wonder, is there a way to close the loop? Can we stop this cycle of contamination and make there be a way so that radioactivity can be contained in a proper way? The answer is no. Plutonium-239, which is the plutonium that was used for this bomb, has a half-life of 24,000 years. That means that in order for us to quote-unquote close the loop, we'd have to keep tabs on this for at least 24,000 years. At some point, the radioactivity is bound to just leak and get somewhere. We can't keep it contained for that long. So there is no way to close this loop. When you make new bombs, when you make nuclear energy, you are going to cause problems for somebody down the line. This has some implications. Who is pushing for nuclear weapons and nuclear energy? Regardless of whether it's nuclear weapons or nuclear energy, the process of refining and mining and then containing the radioactive material is the same. This brings us to our second question: who is paying the price of the process and cleanup? Unfortunately, in this situation, at every step of the way, people of color or people in lower income brackets and the cleanup crew paid the price. As we move forward in our discussion about nuclear energy and how green it is, we need to think, is this really clean energy, and is it really worth the price of the process and cleanup? Thanks for watching, and a special thanks to Professor Edwards.